Speaking here, I know there's different representation from different financial institutions. Some are large banks, some are the credit unions, regulators. Today, I think, is an interesting problem. I'm going to describe it as the SWIFT transparency problem. But essentially, it's about cross-border payments, right? And this is really at the heart of the financial system, right? Trade, sending money across borders. But what does that mean for AML systems? And what could we do different to enhance that? So the first part is, this is actually a two-part presentation. The first part, we're going to talk about the SWIFT transparency problem. I can take questions during the presentation if you like. You can interrupt me, challenge me. That's fine. But then the second half, we're going to talk about AML risk system assessments. So Brenda did a nice introduction, so I'll just give you a few highlights. I worked as a financial crime technology specialist, again, implementing, fine-tuning, validating these systems. I worked on the compliance side and the technology side, but also for large software firms that implement these systems at mainly major banks, but also different clients, merchant acquirers, things like that. So, and just for the people who come from the credit unions, I know maybe your activity might not be that large in international payments, but the little that you do, you want to get the most out of it. And how can you do it? You need to understand how they work. So let's go into it a little bit. So these are OFAC fines, right? Over the past, from 2012 to 2015, 3 of them were over $1 billion. And if you look about, if you really look at the fines and you read the detail, a lot of it was sanctions related, right? And because OFAC, the U.S. sanctions, but it involved cross-border payments, right? But what has changed in the world, and how was SWIFT involved in this, or what could have been done differently? And some of the issues that happened were obviously management, them, obviously turning a blind eye or blatantly not following the sanctions. So that's sort of a different problem. But from a monitoring perspective, what could we do differently? Or how can we make these enhancements? So model risk management, this is really from an OCC perspective, again, since I work in the US, but it's really applicable across the industry, across various countries. Now, when you think of model risk management, there was a gentleman who talked, he has a credit background in one of the presentations. This really came from the credit risk side, right? Because if you think about Basel, and this has been going on for years, the banks needed to put a certain amount of money aside to, finance defaults. What's the probability of default for a loan? But then when you look at all their loans, their portfolio, all their counterparties, you got to net them up, determine, probability of loss, and it gets pretty complicated. And these models are, when they develop them internally, they are extremely complex. You have a lot of data. So this model risk management really came out of that, right? To address the complexity with trying to determine your capital reserve requirements, right? And to do this properly, it's really a liquidity problem. You want to make sure the bank has enough liquidity to cover any losses. So the part I want to highlight here in model validation, if you read the guidelines that were issued by the OCC, one thing they talk about is effective challenge, right? And this could apply to AML systems. So effective challenge is the idea that the people who implement the AML systems, right? Maybe you have a technology unit, they implement the system. They should not be the people that are validating the system. You should have someone on the other side, such as compliance, they go in to validate it. They don't have any connection. They should understand technology, but they shouldn't sit on the technology side. And why do you need that? I mean, you can call it an audit function or whatever. It's not really an audit. It's a validation that your AML models are working as designed. So this is a really important part of the model validations that banks should be doing really annually, part of the reviews. But that effective challenge, really, the person has to have the influence to go in and say, hey, we have to look at our inputs, what are we getting out, is it working, how do we validate it, and if there's problems, they need to have enough influence in the organization to actually change it, right? Because they need to have a connection to upper management and say, look, This is the report. We may need to make modifications to the model. So this is an important part. All right, so this slide, when you think about AML models, right, and AML monitoring programs, you really have, two main players, right? You have compliance, but you also have the developers or technology. Now, what I've seen, especially in the large banks, there's sometimes a breakdown of communication. It really leads to failure. So I'll give you one example. There was an institution I was working at, and they said compliance requirement was, we don't need to monitor these internal accounts. They're really omnibus accounts. They're money going in between. We don't care about it. So technology said, okay, we're going to filter them out. We don't need to, look at this stuff. So what ended up happening was that they figured out later that those accounts actually can make international payments on behalf of customers. And this went on for years. So the filtering aspect of AML models is really important and very dangerous. You want to make sure you know what you're filtering out and why. But what happened here was they had a requirement. Technology said, yes, I understand the requirement. They went back, we're fine, but they really weren't. So that came out in audits, and regulators were aware of this. So this is a serious problem. And it may seem, just filtering accounts, but it's something you need to be aware of. And I think the way you bridge it, you have people that can bridge the gap. But I think today it's not like a business analyst anymore. It's almost, because the algorithms that we're using, the models are more complicated. It's almost you need, like a data scientist, or you could need somebody like this. So this guy, when I was at the European bank, they couldn't find a unicorn, so they ended up hiring me. But the important part was the idea of the effective challenge, right? You need to have that rare skill set that can bridge the gap, but also challenge things about your program so you can identify weaknesses. All right, so one of the things, just to give you an example, I was able to reduce alert volume of the AML system by 20%. And I don't say that just to be like self-edifying. I say it as an example because this was there for a while. And it wasn't even the model, changing the thresholds. It was actually configuration issues, meaning that the way they set it up was incorrect, so it gave them bad alerts. So in the sense of, if you have I don't know which systems people use here, but there's an idea of a workflow for an AML system, and it goes through, the alert starts, you investigate, and then, okay, I'm going to escalate to a case, I'm going to close the case. But some of the systems, when you close them, right, it feeds back into this entity is a good guy, this entity is the bad guy, this entity, I don't know if he's good or bad. But the way it was configured, it looked like they were bad, but they weren't. So that's one example. And then if you go into the whole data side, I know that's maybe a little boring, but it's important because there's a lot of manipulations of data that happens between systems to get the data in from whatever source system you have to the AML system. And it could cause issues if that's not validated. So, all right. So what has changed? I mentioned this briefly. But obviously, I'm sure you're all aware of the Panama Papers, and what does that really mean for us in the AML world? I think it was, shell companies obviously not a new thing, but the sheer magnitude of what happened definitely, I think, shocked some of us. But how does this apply to SWIFT? And it does. We're going to go into some examples, but it applies to SWIFT because you have people that are in one country banking in another and using the ability of really shell companies to hide wealth or avoid taxes or whatever they're trying to do. But there can be indications or red flags that this might be happening. I want to talk about MT202s because it's really important, especially from a regulatory perspective, at least in the US, and it is under scrutiny. So by a show of hands, does anyone, when I say payment, MT202, do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, so some of you heard of that. So a 202 is essentially, it should be used for a bank-to-bank payment, right? Meaning that you have one bank, I want to send the other bank money, right? but it's used, there's plenty of reasons, loan syndication, foreign exchange, whatever it is. But it's not supposed to involve customers. So in 2009, I forget the month, maybe November, somebody might know here, they changed that. They really because of 9/11, the attack on the World Trade Center, there was concerns about the transparency of this message type, right? So they came out with the MT202 COV. And the COV is just, it has the fields in the message for the originator and the beneficiary. It should have their name, their address, this sort of thing. So that's what happened. The one thing I want to highlight here as well is if you read the U.S. Department Justice of Facts for BNP Paribas, there's a line in there, BNP received basically an opinion from a law firm, right? And what it said was U.S. authorities have become especially sensitive to the use of cover payments by foreign banks. So this was definitely on the radar, and the law firms knew about it. They're trying to advise their client. But what does it mean? So the 202, there's no prevention, right? Originating bank, even if you're like a credit union, and let's say you're linked up to the SWIFT system, you could send a 202, right? Send the bank message, but then there's called the 103, which is really, we'll go into the example in a minute, but essentially trying to screen this or detect it is really manual. It's a little complicated, but it can be done with the use of keywords in the message details. And we're going to go into an example, but essentially you try to look for indications that it's used, such as MT103, cover, for beneficiary of. But if it's a bank-to-bank payment and then they're saying for beneficiary of, then obviously it could be concerning. But let's look at an example. So here's an example of in the past of what a 202 would look like. So again, this is completely fictitious. The countries and all this sort of thing don't really matter. But you have an originating customer. Let's say they're in Japan. Let's say their originating bank is in Japan as well, right? Now, the originating customer in Japan wants to send money to the beneficiary in Herzegovina, right, Bosnia. The Japanese customer's bank can't send it directly because they're not in the country and various regulation. They need to have a footprint there, but they don't. So what do? They go through a correspondent bank. They go through a global bank, which has the ability to facilitate the payment. So in the past, what would have happened was you could have had the originating bank just send a 202 to the sending correspondent, meaning the sending correspondent is the big bank, let's say Citibank, but they don't see who the customer is in the payment, right? Now, then maybe Citi goes to Deutsche Bank, and then Deutsche pays their customer, which is the beneficiary bank in Bosnia. The problem with this is the banks in the middle don't know who the customer is. So that's, for the US sanction screening, you're not able to get to that, right? So what would happen is the originating bank would then send the 103 directly to the beneficiary bank and say, hey, that money that you just got from the 202, that looked like it was just the bank-to-bank, send it to this guy's account. So again, the main problem here is that the large banks in the middle that are facilitating the global payments across the world aren't able to see this. So this is why the COV came up. And what should happen, but it doesn't mean that it is that they should be using the cover, the MT202 COV and the 103, the originating bank. But the problem is that there's no technical constraint that the originating bank can't send a 202 and just basically not tell the intermediaries in the middle who's involved. That's the problem, and that's why regulators are looking at it, because you could, based on differences in sanctions and the ability of the bank internally, maybe they don't know this new person is a drug trafficker or they got added as to the list. There could be a number of reasons, but it'd be worth it to look into trying to detect it, and for the originating banks to actually know when to use it and when not to.
Excuse me.
Yes.
The 103, if the bank in Japan still send 103 to Bosnia, that's still being monitored by Japanese government.
Right. So the question was, if the 103 is sent to the to the bank from Japan to Bosnia, it's monitored. That's true. However, that's not completely the full story. The problem is that if you're facilitating the payment, right, through the U.S., and Japan doesn't see this gentleman or person, whoever, as a terrorist, then you're basically evading U.S. sanctions, right? Because you didn't tell the bank in the U.S. who your Japanese customer is. Japan might be monitoring it, but they're sovereign countries, right? So they may have different viewpoints on who's risky, who's not. So that's really the problem. That if you're going through global trade, and U.S. dollar clearing is huge for. It's the #1 currency for global trade. So it is. You are right, but since there's other banks involved, they have their own monitoring requirements.
But then usually 103 will send directly to the beneficiary, and we send through the settlement, like through 202, which is a very normal way of settling it.
Okay, so the mechanics of it, you could have a 103, which is a serial method, right? And that is, you have a 103 that just goes through the chain. The problem with that is, or historically, it's been slower. It's not as cost effective. So what they've done is, okay, let me send the 202 bank to bank because it's faster. Then I'll just send the 103 directly to the beneficiary bank, and that's why it was created. But the main thing is, if you're sending money that's going through other countries, you need to disclose, if it's a customer transfer, who the customer is. That's the bottom line.
You need to tell U.S. If it is a U.S. dollar payment.
Yes.
We only need to tell European if that's a euro payment.
Right.
Doesn't need to know if that's not a U.S. payment.
Yeah, that's true. You're right. So your point is that there could be situations that you don't need to comply with this, and that's true. But what I'm assuming here is that it's U.S. dollar clearing, right? This is just an example. It's the same thing for Canada, right? Canada's going to have its own sanctions, but it may not mirror every other country, right? So, but point taken. All right. So let's go over common SWIFT mapping issues to AML systems. So what are the things that can happen that I've seen that's why it's so hard to do correspondent banking for AML? So here's an example of a MT-103, and essentially you have an identifier, you have the currency, it's US dollar in this case, there's an amount, then we have the originating customer, 50K, that's just a tag in the message, right? So you have their name and maybe an address, city, state. So what you will see here is that traditionally, right, when you look at cross-border payments, what are you looking at? What would be risky? What would it be an alert? It would be the country risk, where is it going to, the frequency, and the amount, right? Those are the three elements. But how do you determine country risk, or how far do you go? So country risk, traditionally, if they use the BIC identifier, right, or the SWIFT code, which is the first 4 characters is the bank identifier, the next 2 is the country. But, so in this case, if you see on 52A, this is the originating bank, BCIT, right, IT, so IT is Italy. So that you can pull out, okay, and this is Italy, you have to have a parsing program to do it. But what about 57D, right? That's just the name of the bank and the city and the country. In this case, it's a little more complicated because if you really want to determine the risk, you would need to basically translate that into the bank identifier and the country where it's at. One other thing that I'll highlight here that you can do. Now, the originating customer and the beneficiary, let's say you have an address, right? And the second one, it looks like it's in Brussels. So what you could do is scan the address and try to extract it. It is complicated to do it, but if you're able to extract the country, then you could feed into your monitoring system how risky the payment is, because you basically break it down by piece. You see everywhere it's flowing to, but obviously from a technical standpoint, going through free text fields and determining the country code based on an address in a global context is very complicated. I mean, you need to have a robust logic for this. But when I talked about the keywords, just real quick before, see 72, this is where, if this was a 202, a field like that, the message details would have things like cover, for benefit of, for beneficiary, things like that. So if there's any questions, I know this may be a little much. Yes?
So I don't come from banking.
Okay.
How does the data get put into those fields? Is it automatic, or is somebody actually choosing to type into each of these fields?
Good. That's a good question. So the question was, how is the data put into these fields? So Swift is actually a global standard. Basically, the banks got together a number of years ago, and they said, okay, we need to make a standard of how to deal with each other. So this is a format that's accepted, right? You need to have certain tags, and there's payment. Swift is just really a messaging protocol. It doesn't actually initiate the money transfer. You have chips and Fedwire to do that, but the way the banks communicate is Swift, and they do this for foreign exchange, letter of credit, trade finance. But to your question, there are certain fields that need to be filled out and validated. So you need to have the correct bank identifier, this sort of thing. But then there's other fields that there's guidelines, but it's really free text. So if you typed in an address, you can maybe say, and this would be a field maybe somebody's actually typing in. They're saying, okay, my customer's in this location, and this is their address. But the way you can represent an address based on the person's training, where their countries can be slightly different. So that's where the variation comes in. It's the ability for that field, which is very specific in the format, but they can really put in anything,
So we actually see them. I work for fund admin, so we're scanning the Swifts to see where the money's coming from.
Right.
And we're seeing, like in 50K or 52A there, where we want the originating bank, we're seeing the sending bank, so we're actually getting details of a corresponding bank.
Right. That's so. The question was, she observed that there could be times where you should expect to see a certain field like a correspondent bank, but you're seeing maybe another bank. And this segues into nicely into parsing Swift messages, which is really complicated. And then, because AML systems, they really evolved over time, and the requirements evolved as well. But when Swift came out, it was for a certain purpose. Now AML has a purpose as well, but they don't necessarily jive very well all the time. So in this case, to your very example, what I've seen when you have messages come in and then you're trying to monitor them for AML purposes, when you try to parse the message and determine who's involved and what country they're from, things can get flipped, right? So you can think that, hey, my originating bank was in Germany, and then my sending correspondent is in Afghanistan, but it's actually switched. The originating bank was Afghanistan, the correspondent was in Germany. So why does it matter? Because some AML systems might not look at the correspondent. You got to see how your model works, but it might just look at the originator, and then you miss that completely. So that's one example, and I think maybe that ties in well. So here's another example. It goes back to the idea that you can represent a bank with a name and an address, right? So, and let's say you're not interrogating the customer and the beneficiary address as well, and you don't really know where they're located. Then you're missing a key risk component in your model. So what does it mean for banks? It really means that they're going to be less efficient, right? You're going to look at more alerts because you basically, you're not able to extract maybe the customer is in a higher risk country. But if you knew that, then you could focus more on your resources investigating the higher risk country. But if you don't know that and it's kind of just a line, then everything's going to kind of bubble up and you don't have a way to differentiate. So this is why it's important for a risk-based approach. All right, so the question, if you look at correspondent banking, there's a big debate. It's been going on for a while, de-risking. Banks say, you know what, I'm not even dealing with this. I want to get out. I don't want to have to serve these countries, these sectors, these customers that they're just too risky. It's not worth it for me. Why am I going to bother? It's not worth it, profitability. The problem, well, the FATF definitely gave guidance that this shouldn't be done, but you know, it really cuts off certain economies, certain countries from the global financial system, and that can have detrimental effects. So there is, you know, negative consequences to this. We don't have to speak about all the details. I just highlight it as a question, you know, what can we do better to serve these sectors, but then focus on the risk that is applicable. So here's some examples of what you can do, some re-risking criteria. One is customer banking outside their jurisdiction. So this is an interesting one. Micro-jurisdictional risk. We'll go into a few examples. And then there's, you know, risk rating methodology and really visualization. What could you do with your payments and look at it from a higher level? And when you think about AML systems, I don't know, again, not sure which ones you use, but they tend to be at the account or the customer level so that they're very focused in on that. But what you could do is go up higher. You can look at payment flows, at categories of customers. And when you look at that, you may find things that are interesting that you may not have noticed before. I'll give you an example of this. All right, so this is a common typology, customer banking outside the jurisdiction. So you have a bank, let's say it's an originating bank in Latvia, but the customer is located in Russia. So how would you know he's located in Russia? Well, his address in that 50K field was a Russian address. Well, how do you determine that? Well, you have logic that parses through it and determines it through, obviously it's a very complex problem and you need large data sets and sophisticated logic to do it, but it's possible. But this, you know, it is interesting. Or maybe another example would be they're in Russia, but then they're banking in, you know, a lower risk country like Germany, which is potentially possible. All right, so micro-jurisdictional risk. This is really a concept, I sort of made this term up. When you think about Belgium, right, in the global context of other countries, what do we feel, you know, what do banks feel about Belgium in terms of AML risk? They have a strong, you know, regulations and this sort of thing. You know, most countries would consider them low risk for any money laundering, rather. So, but what about specific areas so you have this country, right? But what about areas within it? Could it be higher risk for AML, for terrorist financing? You know, it could, but do our AML systems have the ability to go down to that level? So if you think about November 2015, the Paris attacks, right? 130 people killed. March 2016 in Brussels, there was 32 people killed. So these two attacks, what was the common denominator? That 14 people tied to these events, you know, lived in Molenbeek in Belgium at some point. So if Belgium is low risk for AML, should we consider it maybe higher risk in this area? And we don't have to answer that now. That's sort of hypothetical. But I'll give you a real example right now where regulators have cited this. So let me give you another example. Let's look at the US-Mexico border. And please, no one say we're going to build a wall. Okay. So there was guidance issued by FinCEN, right? And what they said was, if you have wires, checks, whatever, coming from different people across, right, maybe 5, 10 people, then it goes to a common beneficiary near the border. Doesn't matter if it's in the US, doesn't matter if it's Mexico, it's a common beneficiary. It's really called Furst in beneficiary payments. It's around $3,000 that they're looking for. So what's that an indication of? Coyotes, right? But the AML systems, if you think the US is low risk and you're not looking at the border, specific cities, zip codes, things like that, how are you going to detect that? Well, you can't. So that's one thing. There's one other example real quick, the tri-border area. I mean, generally South America, like Uruguay, Brazil, I mean, it's generally high risk for, you know, like Canada and the US. But there's a specific area there where these Brazil, Paraguay, they meet. And in this area, there's a few cities in there, but it's really been documented. The report's a little old, but high corruption, high organized crime. There's terror groups, Hezbollah there. I mean, it's really an epicenter for crime and terror because the trade between them, but also the officials that are there kind of, you know, turn a blind eye to it. So this is another area where we could think of micro-jurisdictional risk. So let me give you another example relevant to Toronto. Again, this is hypothetical, but should we be looking at crime rates in certain areas? And well, I wouldn't say crime rates. I'd be more interested in if you can identify through statistics organized groups, organized crime or gangs. And my thought would be that if you have organized gangs in specific areas, I can't cite any examples off the top of my head, but they could have an influence over local businesses, right? So they say, hey, I want you to clean this money for me. They'll have relationships there. They may, the business may make extra deposits through coercion, through maybe they take a fee. But, do we need to look at, on a smaller scale, crime where it is? And obviously they can go to another area and ask another business, but where they are operating, they have, I would think, more control and more influence. All right, event-driven risk. Let me give you an example. If you look, this is really specific to payments, but you can do it in different, data visualization is really the rage right now in all the banks. They're definitely picking up on this because, again, going back to the AML systems, the account and the customer level, let's blow it up and look at a higher view, but also there's a data discovery. You can drag and drop and investigate. You're not sort of contained into what information you get from the system. So it's a bit of a shift. So these are payments, right? You have the country risk, and then really the size of the bubble is the amount of the currency going through. So in March 2014, and again, this is a U.S. perspective, March 2014, there was Russian sanctions issued, right, on certain entities, right? So just tell me if you see anything happen here. If you could look up for 1 second. Did anybody see something? What did you see?
Dot over Mongolia.
Okay. What happened to so you said there was a dot over Mongolia. What happened to the dot?
It was in Russia before.
Okay. Well, the dot got bigger, right? So this is just an example, but if you look at payments, right, and you look at the history of this, if you look at the history of Mongolia, right, for this payments, for this institution, it would be basically within these bands, right? Let's say it's a profile that they had, let's say for 20 months, 30 months. Then all of a sudden, the next month, after sanctions came out, it spiked. So maybe it's a coincidence. I mean, maybe, there's nothing there, but if you're not looking at an aggregated view of payments, you wouldn't notice things like this. And then that's sort of, is there geopolitical risk or event-driven risk in my AML system that I may need to kind of send off tactical units to go attack and look at? Because obviously the world is changing. Different events might affect payment flows across the world. This is going to be the summary for the first half of the presentation here. So 3 takeaways I can think of. Do you have your unicorns? Again, it's a little bit of a silly example, but my point is really that AML systems, whatever you have, tend to be very complicated. But do you really are you siloed and you have kind of people that know certain things, or you have someone that knows everything? They can't really know everything, but if they're an expert in the system, how it works, and they can trace the flow from the data, the alerts, the model, the thresholds, what you get, then that's obviously very valuable for institutions because you want to make sure your model's working properly, right? You have, and you optimize it. You're not wasting resources. So, in a real-time world, why are we calibrating annually? If we do it annually, and we should be calibrating our models annually. But can we go beyond that? So, and again, this is just a technology question, but is your technology really helping you re-risk rather than de-risk? That's the end of this presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
So you talked a lot about parsing and how important that is and obviously how complex that can be.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any recommendations or experience with certain tools that you've used for parsing?
Well, yeah, there's different tools out there. I think this is a technical, you need software to do it. If you want specific recommendations, definitely speak with me after. But it is a technical thing, and some of the banking systems, they're on old technology, or their payment systems, they're not really built to extract these type of elements for AML systems. So they're really to validate the payment and send it along. I mean, that's their purpose. So it is something that if it's a big enough problem for your organization, you would want to look at technology that could help you. Yeah. But I'll give you specific I don't want to say them here, but I'll give you specific recommendations after if you want.